Welcome. Thanks for being here. Apologies for standing behind the thing here. I usually like to move around, but then, I mean, I have a loud voice, but then, the people that are online can hear, so I need to stay here, I guess. That's a bit difficult. Maybe I can, okay, maybe not. Anyway, so, I would like you to meet Steve. This is Steve. This isn't his real picture, of course, but Steve is a real person. He's a mathematician. He knows a lot about graph theory. He has a PhD he knows a lot about cryptography and graph theory. His PhD is in graph theory. He works as a software engineer, and he lives in Staffordshire, England, which is near Birmingham. His full name is Dr. Stephen Henson. And so he's good at his job, right? And because he's good at his job, his regular job isn't exactly just 9 to 5. And because he likes the field that he's in, he started a little side project of his own, which he open sourced after a while. This project, something to do with online security, became increasingly popular. First, it had tens of projects that used it, and then it was a few hundred, a few thousand, and now it's well in the hundreds of millions. So needless to say, this started taking up more and more of his time, and he did this as a side job, as I said, and he worked more and more and more. Fortunately, after a while, he was joined by another guy named Steve, Steve Marquez, who's now 67 years old, I think. And he's sort of the business guy. Steve Henson is the IT guy, but they work together. So these two became later known as the two Steves, and they worked many, many hours. So in 2012, a student from the University of Münster made a code contribution, sent it to Steve. Steve reviewed it, deemed it as good, and he said, okay, it's good, I'll include it in the code base. Only 2 years later, in 2014, people found out that through this code contribution, a crucial vulnerability was inserted into the code base. And this caused the largest security breach in the history of the human race. Compromising passwords, sending governments and companies scrambling. And this is not an exaggeration. It was really, really bad. And you've probably heard of this. It was the so-called Heartbleed Bug. And the library that the first Steve created is the OpenSSL library. Now, only then people started to investigate who are the people behind this project, and they found it was the two Steves, and it created headlines like this that are actually kind of funny. Headlines like this. Sorry. The internet is being protected by two guys named Steve. So a coding error triggered this security breach, and it turned out that the maintainers of this open source library were two overworked, underpaid, underfunded, and largely unnamed volunteers named Steve Marquez and Steve Henson. And the headline is funny, but it was spot on, right? This was OpenSSL. Every software, I think, that uses internet communication still uses OpenSSL. After a while, the OpenSSL Foundation was founded, but according to one source, before the foundation of the OpenSSL Foundation, the first Steve made about $20,000 a year for putting in so many hours. Not exactly what you would call a sustainable, and actually not a fair pay, right? So you've all seen this picture, I assume, yeah. Sorry for using it again, but it's so spot on, right? It's a very typical situation in software engineering where one component builds upon the other, and then you end up a situation like this where everything is dependent on this one component in the corner that is, thanklessly maintained by a volunteer. And if you remove this one piece, then it all comes crashing down, and we're going to spend a long time reassembling civilization from the rubble. right? Another example, obviously, this is much more recent, about 1 year ago, is Log4Shell, Log4j. And the situation in Log4j is very similar to OpenSSL, except it's 3 guys maintaining that code and not just 2, and they don't all have the same first name, right? They're called Ralph, Gary, and Matt. And Ralph Gores, who is the project lead for Log4j, I think even still today, he does this on top of a full-time job. Okay, and this is also, I mean, I don't need to go into this. So, obviously a not so desirable situation. What can we do to remedy the situation? So some people suggested, well, I told you so, open source is not safe, let's not use open source. Obviously, we don't need to discuss this here, right? That's a stupid idea. Another idea that people brought up is, well, you know, every company should have a central governing body that would analyze every open source library before we use it and then whitelist it and say it's okay to use, yeah? All right, I mean, I think it's a good idea to check what kind of open source software you incorporate into your code, but such a central governing body, I don't think that is the solution. It's certainly possible, but I think I have a few better ideas. So the first one would be contribute. Please become active and contribute to open source software. Try to aim for high quality contributions. Don't let this keep you from, you know, making contributions, but try to be diligent about it. Try not to, you know, just throw something there and tell the maintainers, hey, you know, kind of like this, you figure out the rest. Okay, that's not helpful. Now, it turns out contributions was never the problem for the 2 Steves. They had about 200 contributions lying around all the time waiting to be reviewed by them. They were the bottleneck, obviously. So another maybe better way to remedy the situation is to become a maintainer yourself. Okay, if you really engage a lot in one project and you write a lot of code there and maybe you will be asked to become a maintainer, consider it. Yeah, because that is really, as I said, you know, the 2 maintainers, the 2 Steves, they were the bottleneck. So if you step in, you can help. You don't, that doesn't mean you have to give up your life. You know, you can only be a part-time maintainer or something like that, but it certainly helps. Obviously, you can't be a maintainer for all of the open source projects that you use, but you can try. Another option that I think is really good is become a member of a foundation. So there are a lot of software foundations out there, and a lot of them are doing a really good job. So for example, we at Mercedes-Benz, we're a member of the Linux Foundation, Cloud Native, Hyperledger, and Eclipse Foundation, and a couple more. And I think they really do a good job in open source. So that is an option. And here, last but not least, consider becoming a sponsor and fund open source with money. And so this is kind of what this talk is about. So I will dive into this more in the future. So we started at Mercedes-Benz to fund open source projects that we like, that we use. It may seem a bit far-fetched, you know, that a for-profit company would actually do this, because you can obviously get open source for free, but we decided a bit over a year ago we should do this because it's a good thing. So if you go to our GitHub site, you could see this. We're right now sponsoring 34 persons and so developers and organizations. We had some more in the past. They're not shown there anymore because the sponsorship has expired. We'll sponsor some more in the future. So that's on our GitHub sponsors site, right? As you can see, here is OpenSSL. That's not a coincidence, right? I thought that was a good project to sponsor. And Fiber and curl. You probably all have heard of curl. That's one of the most popular open source projects with Daniel Stanberg as the maintainer. And Sindre Sohus, he has hundreds of projects. He's one of the real open source heroes out there. And so Sindre Sohus and also Daniel Stanberg from curl, there are 2 of the few exceptions. They actually do this for a living, maintaining their open source code. and they have enough sponsors that they can live on, but that is certainly still an exception today. All right? Let me show you what options you have to sponsor open source. So the one that we use still at this moment, I mean, still as the only option for now, is GitHub sponsors. GitHub sponsors set this program up a couple of years ago. It's still sort of in a piloting phase. I have a feeling that piloting phase will end soon. They're not taking any fees right now. They said they will take probably something in the 7 to 8% range, only to cover the costs of the program for themselves. They're not making any money off of that. At least that's what they told me. Then another good option that is used quite a bit, I think, is Open Collective or Open Source Collective. They've also been around for a while. They keep 10% on incoming funds. I plan on adding this as an option for us, for Mercedes-Benz in the near future. I just haven't gotten around to doing it yet because it is not that easy, which I will get into in a moment, how to set this up. Other options are here, the Linux Foundation crowdfunding. They don't take any fees for the first 10 million and then 5% after that. And then on the right, you can see some of the smaller options. I don't know them in detail, but I wanted to include them for completeness reasons. So LibrePay, Bounty Source, Stake Social, Tidelift, Issue Hunt, and Access Code. There probably are a few more because more programs are being created. How this works in the example of GitHub sponsors is that we give money to GitHub, and then we tell GitHub, hey, please give it to these developers or these organizations. It used to be in the early piloting phase, it used to be a bit more complicated. I had to actually write an email to them with a list or like with an Excel sheet that listed it, and they did this manually. It was a pilot phase. They have well, professionalized it, I guess you could say. So now I can go to my GitHub profile and I can select the project. I click on the heart, that says sponsoring, and then I can choose how much money for how long and so forth. So now it's much more convenient. Now, let me say a bit about how you can set this up in your organization. So if you're working for a company, I suppose a lot of you are, and you say, that's a good idea, I want to set this up. Let me give you just a bit of a background or maybe a few of the issues that you might encounter on your path. So the first one is how to pay money to someone. A company can't just wire money to someone. It's usually either a purchase, you buy something, or it's sponsoring, traditional sponsoring. So for example, at Mercedes, we would pay a famous sports athlete to wear our logo on their sleeve, and then that person is a name ambassador, and what we get in return is that this person says, hey, Mercedes is cool, and so forth, right? So that's the two ways. Purchasing, you buy something, or you sponsor a person. What is open source sponsoring? I mean, it sounds sponsoring, but do we pay someone money that they wear our logo on their project page or something? Not really. Are we buying something? Not really either. So it's neither really that nor that. And that was a bit of a problem when I set this program up, because how do I pay the money? So I went to our purchasing people and I said, I want to do sponsoring. And they say, well, you need to go to the sponsoring people, because obviously sponsoring. I was like, it's not traditional sponsoring. Well, are you buying something? No, but go to the sponsoring people. Okay, so I went to the sponsoring people. So I told them I want to do this, and then they said, well, but are they displaying our logo, and are they name ambassadors, brand ambassadors? I'm like, no, not really. Well, then it's purchase. Go to purchasing. So it was a bit of a back and forth, circling around, and I talked to many people a lot of times. We got all together and figured this out, because to me, it didn't matter. Is it sponsoring or purchasing? I don't care. I just want to get it done, right? And so we finally decided it's a purchase. We're not directly purchasing something, because it's not like I sponsor your project and then I tell you, hey, for this money, can you please implement this issue? That is a possibility, but that's not the idea behind it, yeah? It's more like, hey, I give you money and you probably know what's best for your project, so please use it in a way that benefits the project, okay? And so we decided sponsoring. Okay, good, check. Now here's the next thing. Compliance is an issue. Compliance is always an issue. It's a very important issue, because when you pay money to someone, you want to know where that money goes. You don't want it to end up in dubious places of the dark web, in places where you don't want it to be, because if that makes the news, that's not cool. Mercedes sponsors the dark web and blah, blah, blah. It's like, oh my God. Okay? So, what companies do when they pay money to someone is they make a little background check. And I'm pretty sure that every company does this. A background check means you need the full name of that person and usually their residential address. And then you put this into a system, and the system will tell you green or not green. Green means go ahead. Red means, oh, not sure, let's investigate further. And then they investigate further, and usually it also comes back green. It's just like 0.00, I don't know, percent that actually has a problem, right? So you need to do these checks. And you need, as I said, at the least you need their full name and residential address. Now, go to the GitHub profile of a developer. Usually they don't give away their full name and address. Sometimes their full name, sometimes no. Address, not usually. So I went to GitHub and I said, hey GitHub, I want to sponsor these people. Can you please give me their names and addresses? And then GitHub said, oh, that's great. But no, sorry, cannot do. Why? Data protection laws. You know, GitHub promised these developers, we are not giving away your information without your consent. So, sorry, Mercedes, you're a third party, can't do it. And I'm like, okay, good. That means I have to approach these people directly. How do I approach them? Some developers on GitHub have their email address, so I can send them an email. Fine. Not everybody does. So if they don't, I can look in the commit message that sometimes has the email address, but not necessarily. So some I found with their email address on their GitHub profile. Some I didn't. Then I looked on LinkedIn. I tried to hunt them down on LinkedIn. I found some on LinkedIn. Some had their own website. I found them there. And then I sent them an email, and I said, dear developer so-and-so, we would like to sponsor you. Can you please send me your name and address? So think about this. All of a sudden, I was that guy sending people emails on the internet saying, hey, get free money. I just need a bit of information from you. But you can trust me. I'm okay, right? So that was a bit of a funny situation there. Yeah, it actually worked out. Maybe, you know, it was like sending from Mercedes-Benz and including the footer and describing everything. Maybe that was trustworthy enough that people saw it's actually not a scam. So I actually got replies. Most people replied right away. Some took a while. Some needed a bit reminding. Hey, I want to give you money. Still, you give me your information. All right. So then that, in the end, it worked out. It's a bit complicated, but it had to be done. But then I was like, okay, guys, I don't want to do this every time we sponsor people, because we sponsor like 10, 20 projects at a time, and it is really taking a lot of time. Now, GitHub, they do the same thing on their site. Before they pay money to someone, they do the sanction list checks. And GitHub has Stripe as a payment provider. They do the sanction list checks as well, because neither of these two has any interest in sponsoring dubious sources. Okay, so at Mercedes, we finally said, let's trust GitHub and Stripe. We don't need to do it on our side. I think we're okay. And now I'm just, but the thing is, you know, I'm just praying. I promised my people at Mercedes, hey, we're going to be okay. And now I just hope we're going to be okay, but because it will backfire. But I don't have any fear, to be honest, because I mean, we look at the project, we usually pick projects that are have been there for a while and the people are known and so forth. So I think we're okay. Just as I said, so there might be a problem setting this up at first. And it took me almost a year from we're going to do it to the first money being paid. And I was not procrastinating, but big companies work in mysterious ways, processes and so forth. Okay, so that's that. Now, feedback from the community. Here's an example. And another one, and another one, and another one, and another one. I'm not going to read them all. I hope you can read them in the back as well. So the feedback from the community was really, really good. And now you're going to say, of course, you're giving people money. People tend to be happy when you give them money, right? Yes, but I think it wasn't even so much the money that we gave them. It was more the recognition, the pat on the shoulder. Thank you, so-and-so, for doing great work in open source. We think you deserve this, and keep on with the good work, and that's what people said. They said, wow, you found out about my project and you use it at Mercedes. That's awesome. Great, thank you. One project, they didn't have a GitHub sponsors profile set up, but as I told you, this is for now the only way we can pay money to open source sponsorship. Oops. So I asked them, I said, hey, you guys, we would like to sponsor you. Would you consider setting up a GitHub sponsors profile? And then they said, sure, we'll do it. They did it, and then we paid the money. And about 3 months or so later, they contacted us again and said, hey, you know what? Thank you for setting this up. Thank you for asking us to create a GitHub sponsors profile. Since we did this, we received money from 20 other people. So they were like, wow, that was a good thing. So I was like, yeah, great. I'm happy. All right. So you can find a bit more information on our open source landing page. This is the address, opensourcemercedes-benz.com. This is still fairly new. We have a few things on there, not super much yet, but you can. We have some of our projects that we have published as open source are there. We have some blog articles. I should write more, but yeah, some stuff is there. I have a little article about the sponsoring program, just a very short summary. And this one here, this is our FOSS manifesto. That's actually something interesting. Oh, I think it's interesting. At Mercedes-Benz, up until about 5-6 years ago, we didn't really use open source. If it's not invented here, maybe we shouldn't rely on it. Now, today, it's kind of stupid. You can't develop software anymore these days without open source, yeah? And it also just doesn't make sense. Even if you had all the budget in the world, you still wouldn't have all the time in the world, let alone the developer manpower to develop everything yourself, right? I know at an open source conference, I'm preaching to the choir. I don't need to tell you this. But so we decided to take open source into our IT strategy at Mercedes-Benz, and not just use, but also fully embrace it. That means also contribute and create our own open source projects and publish them. If you just use, you're not utilizing the full potential that open source has, right? And so we are telling our engineers, please be active in open source, contribute, publish your own stuff as open source. And because it wasn't really working that we put this on slides and publish the slides, news tend to travel really slowly in a big company. So we thought we needed to do something a bit more radical. And so a colleague and myself, we sat down and we wrote the Mercedes-Benz FOSS manifesto. You probably all know the Agile manifesto. So the idea is a bit along these lines. And in this manifesto, that's kind of a key pillar now, how we want to be a good citizen, how we want to become a good citizen in open source. So it's not only we allow our engineers the time to do this on company time, but we actually send them on a mission. Please be active in open source. And this is endorsed by our CIO and by our CEO. And that's actually very important because you need this. If you're making assumptions about how people can use their working time, you better have C-level engagement, right? Otherwise, you're going to be in a lot of problems. Yeah, so here's the FOSS manifesto. It's free to use as well. It links to a GitHub repo. You can, if you think this is nice, you can use it. You can alter it in any way you like. We put it under Creative Commons 0 license, least restrictive. So you can just maybe use it as a blueprint and say, this is good for our company as well. Change it, alter it, and you don't have to credit us. Okay, just maybe take a look. All right, that's almost it. Oh yeah, here, this is the 10 seconds of commercial. We're hiring. Yeah, I know who isn't these days, but we're a really cool company to work for. I think I've been there 15 years, so I'm actually convinced that it's a good employer. And we make nice cars as well. I don't know if you like cars. So here is our website. And so that's basically it. I hope I have inspired you. Think about if you and your company can perhaps sponsor open source software as well. I think if more and more companies do this, we can really make a difference. We can really change the world, and meaning the open source world, make it more sustainable, right? It's the right thing you do. You want to not just take, you also want to give back. The right thing to do is something that usually gets dropped when the economic times get a bit more tough. Yeah, now you can say it's nice, it's the right thing to do. But what is really behind it is that it's the right thing to do because it makes it all more sustainable, and because it helps to ensure that the projects we use and we depend on are still around tomorrow. That's why it also makes sense from an economic point of view. Okay, please rate my talk on the app. I guess you can do that with the All Things Open app. We have time for some questions, but for now, thanks very much for listening.